So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dennis Liu. We're so delighted to have you here with us. Dennis is from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, working with the Half Earth Project. Thank you, Dennis.
Terrific. Thank you, Sophie. So great to be here. Several years ago, John Leibowitz agreed to do an interview aimed at educators and students. That's the bulk of my work with the foundation, is education. And so it's really great to be back, to be able to sort of return the favor. And in the process, I got to know I am a monthly contributor. I should probably up it a little bit, but it's a terrific organization, and I just love your mission. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get into my presentation. Folks, keep your minds and your fingers nimble. I may ask you to use the chat for a few things here and there. So let's go ahead and get started with my slides. And I trust everyone can see the slides okay. Get into presentation mode. All right, so slides look good, Sophie?
Yes, that looks great.
Perfect. Okay. Well, anyway, most people, particularly in an audience like this, are familiar with E.O. Wilson. He's often credited with, in fact, certainly with popularizing, if not inventing, the term biodiversity, also biophilia, bioblitz. So Ed had a huge influence on the conservation world. He was really dedicated. He would talk about how we really live on a little explored planet, and the vast majority of species that we share this planet with don't even have names. So the bulk of biodiversity has really not even been discovered yet, let alone really studied scientifically. And Ed was fairly prolific and a beautiful writer. He published over 30 books. So he had a really outsized influence on folks like me. And I wanted to start off just by sharing one of the people that Ed influenced, Laurette Savoy. Laurette's really a geographer. She doesn't really, she's not really, I don't think she identifies as being a scientist, but she is a writer. And she wrote a book called Trace, where she explores through her own family history the American landscape and where we've got place names from, the complicated history of the social and other aspects of how we've used the land as we essentially, colonized this continent. But early in the book, Laurette quotes from one of Ed's books, The Diversity of Life. And I just want to start out here to kind of set the theme overall, which I also think summarizes a lot of Ed's thinking and philosophy. So she quotes Ed as saying, "Our troubles arise from the fact that we do not know what we are and cannot agree on what we want to be. The primary cause of this intellectual failure is ignorance of our origins. Humanity is part of nature. We're a species that evolved among other species. The more closely we identify ourselves with the rest of life, the more quickly we will be able to discover the source of our human sensibility and to acquire the knowledge on which an enduring ethic, a sense of preferred direction, can be built." And Laurette goes on to say, perhaps danger lies most basically in not recognizing who and what we are. So our overall mission at the foundation and at the Half Earth Project, and in particular in my education programs, is to try and help people get toward that reset of their thinking. This notion in our urbanized lifestyles that somehow we're apart and separate and independent from nature, when in fact we are absolutely part of nature and dependent upon it. Now I'm going to talk For the rest of the talk, I'm going to be probably less philosophical and a little more technical about some of our approaches to conservation, but I wanted to start off with that. Now, our key project is called the Half Earth Project, and I'm sure when you even hear that, it evokes all sorts of ideas in your mind. Ed published Half Earth in 2017, and the foundation, we've really worked to turn an influential book into a project that can actually forward a mission of conserving biodiversity. And in Half Earth, my favorite chapter, if you're only going to read one chapter, read chapter 2, where Ed talks about the biosphere compared with the immense bulk of the planet as a whole is a razor thin thing. And it's kind of obviously fragile when you view the biosphere layered onto this complex planetary system that we call Earth. He obviously makes the main point he makes in the book really is that we are dependent on this biodiversity and that we need this biodiversity. Now, if you think about the planet, if you think about, for example, Mount Everest, and I assume that most people listening have not been to the top of Mount Everest, nor have they been likely to have been in the Mariana Trench, that distance, which is sort of the limits of what we think of as the livable surface of our planet, that's about 14 miles. Now, the radius of Earth is about 4,000 miles. So in a very literal sense, life really is a thin layer for the most part on the top of the planet. So I think this is a pretty good analogy. You can view it. The Earth is a big fat apple, and we're all occupying the skin. All the millions of species that we share the planet with are in this thin, fragile layer. Now, of course, I think everyone should care about biodiversity, and I just wanted to lay out a few reasons to think about. I'm sure that this audience thinks that nature is beautiful. I hope that most of you find it calming and healing. I personally, I've always loved nature, but I really engaged with it because I think species are fascinating. I just want to understand how they work, why they work, why they have particular adaptations, how they interact with other species. So I was always driven by curiosity, and I think a lot of young people are. And then I think it's also important to point out that species have their own interests and rights. And sometimes in the Western dominated reductionist scientific thinking, a culture that I'm largely part of, we forget that the idea that species are here for our purposes is not actually a dominant thinking across many cultures and civilizations. But of course, in today's complicated world, a world where jobs and economy understandably dominate the way people think, there's all these good utilitarian reasons. And as I've already mentioned, we depend on these ecological functions for clean water, clean air, energy, food. And even for very particular things, the vast majority of medical advances are typically inspired or even directly derived from nature. And again, in Half Earth, Ed writes about this really beautifully. He says, each species is a wonder to behold. He reminds us that every species has had a long history on the planet. We all began from that single spark of life on this planet. A champion emerged in our time after a long struggle of thousands or millions of years, the best of the best, an expert in its niche. So there's no real hierarchy in nature in that sense. And then on the utilitarian side, again, Ed writes beautifully that biodiversity as a whole protects us all. All the species together and our interactions forms a shield that protects each individual species. And if you start pulling that shield apart, we risk losing the entirety of it. Now, how did we get to this? So biodiversity is endangered. That I think it's well appreciated, perhaps not as well appreciated as the climate crisis is now, even though obviously there's argument over what can be done or should be done about it. There are some denialists, but climate has a very general recognition as a crisis. Biodiversity is a crisis that is on par with climate. And it's because the human population and the way we use the land has crowded out the rest of nature. So this cartoon, this graphic, I think very effectively depicts what's happening. So the dark brown squares in the middle represent the human population. And here he's representing it by talking about just tonnage, the weight of mammals on the planet. So at 7 going toward 8 billion people, we are literally a huge mass, a huge biomass on the planet. And even more than our own bodies, all our domesticated species that we depend on for food, that we keep as pets, that has crowded out a planet that once was all green squares. And we've pushed wildlife out everywhere as we've spread around the planet. You can see at the bottom, elephants are represented by a single green square, heavy, bulky animals, probably about 500,000 elephants left, down from a population of probably 11 million at its height. So we've caused this problem. At the same time, we're dependent on this nature. What can we do about it? No one else is going to do anything to try and alleviate this problem, obviously, other than humans. So we have to decide and be committed to taking action. Now, the good news is that conservation action actually works. So I'm just giving you an example of that here from a paper that reviewed and tried to be very careful in documenting cases where conservation action very likely prevented an extinction. So from 1993 to 2020, we have about, it's likely 32 species of birds worldwide have been brought back from the brink of extinction, and 16 mammals. Now, there's an estimated 35,000 vertebrate species on land. So of the 10,000 birds, we've managed to bring 32 back from the brink of extinction, and of the 5,500 estimated mammals, 16. So it works, but part of the motivation for the Half Earth Project and Ed's insight was that we really need a bigger goal. We can't have the effort be so piecemeal. We'll lose way too much as we wait to try and reverse this extinction crisis. So in the book, Ed said that the only solution to the extinction crisis would be to put half of the planet into protection for the rest of nature. So he set down the goal, and as I mentioned, we're trying to work towards specific tools to help actually achieve this goal. So I just wanted to quickly talk about what protected areas are. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is an international European-based organization, actually has a very rigorous set of criteria for designating areas that are protected for biodiversity. But I just wanted to show you a few examples because, of course, the Northeast Wilderness Trust, some of the lands that the trust has stewardship over meet these criteria. Obviously, most people are familiar with national parks, perhaps with national monuments, nature reserves, wilderness areas. So these are the kind of areas that we're working toward trying to increase the number. And this comes out of, in part, comes out of Ed's work on island biogeography, which says, as the area that under protection for nature, the areas that's supporting biodiversity goes up, you get a logarithmic increase in the number of species that can be supported by that area. That's why increasing areas, connecting areas is extremely important. So I won't talk about why half. There's lots of independent pieces of evidence showing that half globally is about the right number to protect the bulk of biodiversity. Most of our project time and effort is spent toward trying to provide tools and thinking about which half. How do we prioritize places to protect? Because importantly, life on the planet is not evenly distributed. So we don't want to protect an arbitrary or sort of random half. We want to prioritize and be selective about places. So if you're trying to make good conservation decisions, so a map can be very helpful for doing this. And if you're trying to make good conservation decisions, what are some of the key things you want to know? Well, you want to know where things live. So as I mentioned, unevenly distributed. So one of the main things that we're doing is collecting the best data on where where species live on the planet, and mapping very specifically at high resolution with a goal of 1 kilometer resolution for the whole globe where things live. Now, because we have the best data for vertebrate species, that's what we've emphasized so far. But we are adding plants and insect taxa to the data as we build capacity to add that data. Now, another important layer is what's already been protected. And the average global number, where our goal is 50%, the average global number is 15%. And it is not necessarily the best 15%. In other words, the areas that are necessarily the richest in species are not necessarily the ones being protected. And then another important, another essential layer is human impacts. And as I alluded to, urbanization, where we live, is a human impact. The biggest human impact, though, in fact, is agriculture, including all those animals we're raising for meat and other purposes, but also all the crops. So the human pressures are another essential layer. We take those 3 layers to basically then come up with a priority layer. So where are the parts of the landscape that we have the best potential to actually protect and that would be most important to protect first? So that layer looks like this, and you can see that it's different. In this slide, I'm showing you species richness. And the map typically uses, a technique we call heat maps. So you can see in Amazonia here, very rich in species. So it shows up as bright yellow. Places with fewer species, vertebrate species, terrestrial vertebrate species in this case, show up in cooler colors. So you get that relative, you can get the gradient of species richness you can see in this glimpse of the map. Now, priorities don't map exactly to where those species are because because in some cases there's already protection there. So what I'm showing you here are areas that would be priorities to take action to protect next. And that is likely due to low human impact in those areas, high biodiversity in those areas. And you can see, for example, that the Andes Mountains are important, Middle America, Central America in general lights up. And in many cases, islands, because they have rare species, also make it to the priority list. So here you can just see, I work a lot with students and teachers. So I do a lot of, let's compare patterns and ask questions. So here you can see why you can see that the priority layer, because it includes more information, does not exactly map to the richness. It's not as simple as that. Now, I do a lot of work kind of showing maps and talking about abstract things like richness and rarity of species. But of course, what people really care about are creatures. So on the education side of things, especially, I develop a lot of information and tools to draw people in to get interested, maybe first with only a single animal, and then start asking questions about all of the animals, right? So if you think hummingbirds are beautiful, maybe you can become interested in how many hummingbirds are there in the world? What is the biodiversity of hummingbirds look like? How do different species lifestyles differ, for example? So we have lessons, and this is an example of a story map that I think you could find. So this really emphasizes the charisma of some of the biodiversity that we're talking about. But now if we go back to the map, I just want to make a very simple, show you how the map can make simple and important points. So here we have this globe that I mentioned. Now I'm going to, here's the 3 layers. I'm going to activate the layer that has high resolution on hummingbird species. And you can see that the globe immediately spun to the New World, to North and South America. And I'm showing you that the heat map is gray in the rest of the planet. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat now. And now here, I just clicked to species richness. And actually, we're going to zoom. I'm going to zoom in on the United States. Now I'm zooming in on the West. And you can see this heat map. There we're going back to the richness pattern. So I'm going to ask you to put into the chat just a couple of observations or even questions that you had about the map. Just give me a few people type in some observations. What did you notice when I clicked on hummingbirds? Yeah, no hummingbirds in the rest of the world, migration patterns, what time of year? Oh, those are great questions. Okay, so you would be, this group would be some star students. That's exactly what we're looking for. So that the first key observation is exactly no place else in the world but the Americas has any hummingbird species. They're completely endemic, indigenous to our part of the world. Migration came up in time of year. This is collecting, basically we use data on where every species lives. We stack it up. There's 350 species of hummingbirds, about. Another important point, species was discovered just 5-6 years ago. There's still new species of hummingbirds to be discovered, but there's about 350 species. And you can see that the Andes is particularly important for rare species, which means species that live only in a small area. As you might expect, Amazonia has lots of species, but fewer rare species compared to the Andes. And you can see that the United States is not super rich in hummingbird species. I'm going to ask you to use the chat. How many species in the territory of the Northeast Wilderness Trust? How many species of hummingbirds can you see on that you might see on Northeast Wilderness Trust properties? All right, this crowd knows they're hummingbirds. That's right, just one species. So again, in this sort of mapping and biodiversity talk, we would say the eastern United States is not rich in hummingbirds, but we have this one species, which is awesome. The West, by comparison, slightly richer, about a dozen species. But it's the Andes and the Amazonia and Central America where the rest of these 350 species live. And I just want to mention, in the lessons we've developed, we do talk about hummingbird migration, and it's very dramatic to see the seasonal migrations. And so the ruby-throated hummingbird, who nests, we think of it as our American bird that nests here. But of course, it's completely dependent on wintering feeding grounds, winter feeding grounds in Mexico and Central America. Okay, so now the map, so you can explore this map and you can see global patterns of biodiversity protection, human pressures. We've also added, because nation states are so important and influential in conservation, you've probably heard something about 30 by 30 and the various international conventions on biodiversity. The UN convenes these conventions on climate, on biodiversity. So nation states are important just because they have the power to make that sort of top level policy. They have power and resources. So we've developed, as part of the map, basically a series of report cards. So I'll show you that now. So here you see we're looking at the at priorities in Africa is where we started out, but I clicked on the report card tab. And the map takes a little time to load this data. And here's another heat map. And this is showing the hotter the color, the more red and yellow, the more purple the color, the better you're doing as a nation in protecting the biodiversity that you have stewardship over. So you can see as we went by, there's a patchwork of different colors. And then what you can do if you're using the map, and I encourage you to visit, it's free to use on your own. Here, I've clicked on the United States. You get a score of 48 and 2,600 species. So remember that number, 2,600 vertebrate species in the United States. Then I clicked on Analyze Area, and you get more information. You can see where the US is ranked, maybe surprisingly for the world's wealthiest country, that we're right about in the middle. On the other hand, we're a very large country, which means there's challenges to protect your biodiversity associated with that. But we have a bunch of tools here where you can compare different countries. You can look at different rankings, and you can see things like how many species there are. So for example, the United States, one of the issues is we have 500 endemic species. So that is a lot of species, meaning rare species, range limited. That's a large number of species to be responsible for. And endemics are, because they're more prone to mishap for all sorts of reasons, because they're more vulnerable, they are more important to protect. So the better you protect endemics, the better your score is going to be. Now let's look at the United States in a little more detail. I think it's useful because, again, since the Northeast Wilderness Trust is in the eastern part of the United States, we're such a big country, and these important patterns really they vary in important ways across the map. So the U.S., we have about 13% of our land protected. And as probably most people are aware, there's a huge concentration of federally owned land in the West. Estimates are about 40%. In the East, and in particular, in the Northeast Wilderness Trust, those are some of the states. You're in some of the states with the fewest acres of federal land, because federal policy, those large land holdings, those can be in some ways they're already owned by the public. The path toward increasing their protection is more straightforward. In the East, these other mechanisms can be, like trusts, like the Northeast Wilderness Trust, can be even more important. I just wanted to show an example. If you're thinking of, when we think about how to go from the current state of 12%, which is not going to sustain the biodiversity, especially with impending increasing human development, that's not going to slow in the very near future. So one way we can think about increasing this is to model, and one of our Half-Earth ambassadors, Mel Wilson, she has modeled what you could do if you just gained the buffer lands around federal lands and parks and already protected areas. And it is possible to get to that 50% goal. First, the 30% goal of 30 by 30, and then the ultimate 50% goal can be achieved by increasing these areas. Now, this is just a model to show that it can be done. It would obviously be a big feat to influence the right people to get this to actually happen. Now I want to talk a little bit about the lands of the Northeast Wilderness Trust. In this area that I mentioned actually does not have these huge swaths of federal land that we could consider converting to national parks or upping their protection for biodiversity. So I just love how many properties the trust has managed to protect and assume stewardship over. And I want to show you what this looks like on the Half-Earth map. So here I've activated the layer that recognizes protected areas. So protected areas are showing up in green, and priority areas that, again, we've identified by using our measures, which measure species richness, species rarity, human impacts. The areas that we've prioritized for protection are shown in blue. So you can see that there's some complementarity with areas that have already been protected. Obviously, this huge area in upstate New York is the Adirondacks. You can see that, protected areas are distributed in a fashion throughout the whole area that Northeast Wilderness Trust is interested in. Okay, so now it's quiz time. This is the first quiz, and I'm going to ask you to use the chat. The Half-Earth map can tell you a little bit about each of these states. So we have the national report cards, but we also have information state by state in the US. So of the 6 states that are part of Northeast Wilderness Trust, I want you to put in the chat which state you think has the most vertebrate species, home to the most vertebrate species. All right, get a New York vote, Maine, Vermont, Maine. All right, these may just be home state votes, right? All right. That's good. It's fun to see where the votes are. But New York is getting a lot of votes. Okay. All right. So coming in at 6th place is Vermont. So again, this is information I've just pulled off the Half Earth map. I encourage you to explore it on your own. Estimated 307 land vertebrate species in Vermont. Only 5% of Vermont is formally protected for biodiversity. Okay, coming in at number 5 is New Hampshire. Similar number of species. I'm sure that you can guess why New Hampshire has a few more species than Vermont, and just a sliver more land protected. New Hampshire is actually one of the states in the East that has significant federal land. I think it's something like 11%. And then coming in at 3rd is Maine, 342 species, 5% protected. Connecticut, 345 species, 7% protected. Massachusetts, and all those votes for New York. You're smart. Maybe it's just the size of the state. I'm not sure, but New York actually is home to significantly more states. Again, for a variety of reasons that I like to work through some of the reasoning for these things with students and instructors. Okay, so you did well in that quiz. Now here, I've used the map to zoom in on the northwest corner of Connecticut. So I just wanted to show you that you can use our map to explore protected areas all around the globe and at very high resolution. So this is the northwest corner of Connecticut, and what this little circle is a protected area in this part of the state. And then if you click on that area, you get this sort of a report back. You can see that this is the, I can't actually read it. Now I've forgotten what the name of this reserve is, but I know that Northeast Wilderness Trust actually has either owns the easement or owns property associated with this land trust in this part of Connecticut. So you can see that there's 218 species here, and you can ask interesting questions about, what proportion of species is that, compared to the whole state. And so you can use this tool to explore protected areas anywhere you're interested in. I wanted to show, and then I just wanted to show also, you can explore the human impacts in this area. So if you're interested in this part of Connecticut and you care to do more about protecting biodiversity there, you can ask questions like, what are the human impacts? And it turns out agriculture is not a huge human impact in this area. You can see here this is the little tiny area of the Salisbury land trust. But you can see that Hartford and Greater Hartford urbanization is the big human impact for this particular area. Now, I'm shifting to Vermont here, the headquarters of the trust. And in this view from the map, I've got human impacts are showing up in red, and you can see that the state of Vermont has relatively little and pretty highly concentrated human impact. There are a couple zones shown in blue that would be priorities to protect, again, by the measures we use. And then you can see in green the already protected areas in Vermont. And I just wanted to point out that I wanted to use this view of Vermont to mention another tool that's available on the map. So I showed you that you could tour around and look at already protected areas, but you can also draw your own area of interest in order to get additional information. And so between Burlington here and Montpelier, right around here, there's a ski resort, Bolton Ski Resort. So what I did was, and you can see some of what the ski development looks like. It's adjacent to state forest. So I just used our drawing tool and I just drew this polygon around the area to ask how many species live there. You know, what is, you know, and I know that students from UVM, for example, do some studies in this area. So you can ask questions about this sort of customized area of interest. Now, if we hit the Analyze Area button, you can get a view like this, which will, you know, estimated that there's 194 species here. And in fact, you can use the tool to, if you're more interested in birds, for example, you can look at just what bird species might I expect to find here, and you can get a little information on those species. Now, here, this is sort of the last view of the map that I'm going to show you, because I want to make one more point about protected areas. Now, you know, again, because the Northeast Wilderness Trust is dedicated to forever wildlands, obviously the organization and its supporters understand something about the value of wilderness and supporting species. Because of course, we can support land because it has a beautiful landscape, you know, for its scenic value without necessarily thinking about the species. But there's a very important connection. If we take care of the species, in many instances, we can also help alleviate climate change. So we have a layer on the map that I'd shown you previously. So here I'm just sort of scrolling around. Whoop, not Pennsylvania. You know, you can see the various states that are in the trust. Now, if we go to the map layer, which I'm going to manage to do here. If we go to the map layer, you may have noticed this carbon layer, and we call it irrecoverable carbon. And that means if this forest, it's usually forest, but it can also be grassland. If these areas are developed, cleared, that will be a net increase to climate change, and we will lose carbon that's been sequestered for a long time. And so I just wanted to give you a little view of how these, what the coincidence is between areas that are protected and areas that could be valuable for biodiversity. Many of them obviously are important also for sequestering carbon. So there's an important link between doing right by biodiversity and doing right by the climate as well. So again, I really hope that you'll take some time to explore the map on your own, and I would be happy to hear from anybody and answer any questions you may have about the map and how it's used. I'm going to end with this slide, which is just talking in general about the various things that the foundation is interested in. Most importantly, though, we're trying to build a movement culture, and we need you. This is Ed's declaration of the goal, and we need everyone to be part of that. And if you visit the Half Earth Project website, you can sign the Half Earth Pledge, and you can be connected with us. I also have a educator ambassador group. If you know teachers who are looking to infuse biodiversity into their curriculum, they should contact me, or they should look on the website to sign up to be an educator ambassador. We have lessons, some based on the map, some based on other things. Oh, here's another example, another story map about dragonflies. They're really an interesting contrast with the pattern of hummingbirds, for example. So every state in the US has some endemic dragonflies. We have about 700 species of dragonflies in the United States. And yeah, so I think oh, this is my ambassador. That's my ambassador sign up. And I think I'll go ahead and stop there and take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a fun tool. I had not seen that map before, and I could imagine getting sucked into that for hours.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of questions from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's dive in. So a couple of people were asking about so the quantity of land that you're talking about that's protected, it seemed like was focusing a lot on federal lands and those publicly available lands. And a couple of folks were pointing out that there's cattle grazing and some logging, depending on the status of the lands, some very intensive recreation. Are all of those sort of like considered protected and towards the half Earth goal, or how do you make that distinction?
Yeah, that's really important. My purpose of showing that was that those lands are certainly not all protected for biodiversity. It's really to show the potential, right? So if one model was to, let's take all of the federal land and convert it to a protected purpose for biodiversity, how far would that get you? And even if we did that, we would not achieve partly because those lands are so concentrated in the West, we would obviously miss all the important species, and really the hotspots for biodiversity in the US are actually in the Southeast. But I always like to make the point that there are rare and important species distributed everywhere. So, it's not a matter of let's only protect the very richest places, but those places do become priorities. So I was trying to make the point that that's one way to think about it, and it actually to motivate the work of places like Northeast Wilderness Trust. In the East and overall, you're not going to achieve the goal, even if you could convert all of those federal lands. But the fact that you have so many fewer federal public lands in the East means you have to think about the conservation challenge in a completely different way. And again, that's why the role of Northeast Wilderness Trust is so important.
That's very helpful. And then in the map, when you showed, you brought up all the states in the Northeast region, which was so cool to see those vertebrates. And there are a couple of states that had 5% all the way up to 12% in New York. What constitutes those percentages? Is that including federal, state, and privately protected lands? What goes into that math?
So those are lands that meet the I know I very rapidly mentioned that the IUCN, the International Union for the Protection of for the Conservation of Nature, they have a system where they designate various protections. So, for example, not every state park will necessarily count because of the way that land is allowed to be used. Now, all of that land is not at the level that that Newt is protecting land. In other words, forever wild. My understanding is you have some properties, you call ambassador properties, where you're actually maybe encouraging more human use. So, there's the extreme version is this is wild. We don't even have trails, Then the next level is, access by humans, mostly by trail, so that they can experience some of this wilderness. And then all the way to some extractive purposes. But all of those that make the cut to be on our land, that count on our map and that were listed in that, those percentages are based on a promise, a commitment, legal or otherwise, to not modify that landscape past a certain level. Like logging would not, we would not count logging, but there could be some extractive human impact in some of those areas.
Got it. That's really interesting. So when we're looking at those states and we pull them up on the map and we see 5%, that really is like 5% towards the goal of half for nature.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's so cool.
Yeah, and if you run the numbers in the East, for a variety of reasons, this is where, we want to be careful, and also why we did the national report cards. In the Eastern US, it's probably, you don't need half to get to that goal of 85% of species and ecological. The point is to preserve the ecological functions that we depend on.
Yeah.
And in the East, probably 30%. The right 30% would achieve that. So again, the strategy of a Northeast Wilderness Trust is great and can really have an outsized contribution to that.
That's just wonderful. So we've got a question from Ralph, who's wondering, when we're looking at the map that shows the species richness and all those biodiversity hotspots, does that include microorganisms? And are there efforts around protecting microorganisms?
Yeah, such a great point. So I think the short answer to the microorganisms is no. And I think where it would come up is in a known charismatic or useful microorganism, right? For example, certain microorganisms that can live in hot springs. So we know they have special enzymes that have adapted them to live in those hot springs. And it turns out those organisms can be very useful in medical research, for example. So in that case, an argument to protect a microorganism might be made to protect a particular hot spring. But to be very honest, our data is even worse than that. Not only are we, our priority layers and the framework for thinking about protection that we're presenting to you is completely based on vertebrate species, because we have good global data for that. So when you do a big project like this and have the kind of scale we have, it's a massive amount of data, and you run into all these uneven data quality issues. So, but the good news is we have cactus and conifers, and we're going to add more plant species. And then we're specifically adding information on the odonates, which is my favorites, the damselflies and the dragonflies, the bees, which again, the US is extraordinarily rich in bee species, well over 2,000 native bees. And it's a great example of, honeybee colony collapse disorder makes all the news, but that's an introduced species. And we're losing all the important pollination and other services that these bees provide by over-focusing actually on this one introduced species. Yeah. So bees, ants, odonates, and moths and butterflies. So again, for obvious reasons, just like the birds, there's people who love watching and observing these creatures. We know a lot, so we have relatively good data. So we're going to keep adding data to the map, but we have to keep building capacity and support, honestly, funding to do that. So that's the limiting factor.
That's right. And for folks who were present for Janet McMahon's talk, which was at the beginning of the series, she talked about how if people were to write a book on biodiversity, most of the chapters would be missing in terms of what we know versus what we don't. And my understanding is that a lot of what we don't know is within that realm of microorganisms, fungi, that like lichens and liverworts, who we just have a lot more research and study to do, and there's just so much out there.
Yeah, I think I think it's important to give attention. I mean, I would say we have a lot on our plate, to be honest, even just to protect the sort of more obvious and known. But the good news is we also look at where would we expect to discover new species, because as I mentioned, we have names for about 2 million of the non-microorganism species. So the mostly big things, but including insects, we have names for 2 million. It's estimated there's 10 to 30 million. So we obviously have to we have to discover and then study many more species to understand. And of course, it turns out every species we've studied now is dependent on a whole variety of microorganisms. So many people have probably heard this, where, we're colonized, there's more microorganism cells in and on us than there is our own cells, and there's more DNA from microorganisms than our own DNA. So it makes that point that I made of Ed's very early in the talk. We're all interdependent, interrelated, and it's a mistake. The cautionary principle says, don't destroy it before you actually know what it's doing. So,
absolutely. I want to note for our audience that we are at 6:30, and Dennis has generously offered to stay on for another 10 minutes or so. So we'll continue to take a couple more questions. We welcome you to hang out and hear more for the remainder of the Q&A. And if you have to run to something, this is still being recorded, and we'll be sending that link at the end of the week. So I'll jump to a question from David. It's a big one. How do we protect biodiversity, such as hummingbirds, who are losing their land as the human footprint consumes more of their land and resources? What do you think?
Well, right. So I think it's useful to think of it in pieces, right? So if you care about the ruby-throated hummingbird, we have a lot of power where we live, in the East, to protect to make sure that they have nesting areas, and that they can also, that they have access to food and they can raise their young. Now, the complication with hummingbirds and many other birds, I forget what the proportion is, but a huge proportion of the, I don't know how many species, many hundreds of species of birds that we have in the US, a high proportion are migratory, right? So then the question becomes, this is the problem with these political boundaries, which by and large, have nothing to do with natural boundaries. The species don't recognize these boundaries in any way. So we have to cooperate, at an international level. In the case of birds, I will say, for example, we have some lessons and curriculum that we've done on this. There is bird-friendly coffee. And so the concept of agroforestry is an example of how people who don't necessarily think about these things, or might not prioritize setting aside land, they can understand how it would be better to source your food in a way that supports biodiversity. So it's important to point out, agroforestry is not as good as just leaving the native forest, but it is a huge benefit over clearing the land, which has all sorts of negative effects for the climate and for the biodiversity. So that's bird-friendly coffee really can have significant effect on many of the neotropical birds, for example.
That's great, and it's delicious at the same time.
That's right. That's really good stuff.
So I'm gonna pitch you a question from Doug, going back to the map. The last map you showed us was showing the carbon, and you talked about irrecoverable carbon. Doug is wondering if you could explain in a little more detail what that means.
Yeah, it's a very technical term, and we went back and forth. But if you picture a native forest, and again, these are places that the Northeast Wilderness Trust is protecting. Those mature trees are storing a lot of carbon. The undisturbed soils are storing a lot of carbon, and there's natural cycles going on there that are on average either net zero or net positive for carbon storage and for buffering against climate change. So it's pretty irrecoverable. Really means if you log that forest, you have now you've both released a good share of that carbon back into the system, and then you've lost the carbon buffering functions of that ecosystem that you've disturbed. So that's what the irrecoverable measure is about. So because even if if the day after you logged that forest, you replanted forest you started to replant forest somewhere else, or even as a part of that, or you had an idea of growing a tree crop there, that is not going to sequester carbon. In fact, it could have the opposite effect in the early stages of that. You could actually be aggravating climate change if that's not properly done. So it's pretty common sense, basically, undisturbed open land. If you disturb it, it releases carbon.
Great, thank you. And one resource on that Northeast Wilderness Trust has, which I'll include in that follow-up email, is our Wild Works 1.1, written by our board president about wild carbon, and it gets into a little more nitty-gritty of why the younger forest can't catch up to an older forest in a time scale that, in terms of the worst effects of climate change, is going to make a difference. So I'll include that in the email.
Well, that's right. Now I need to share some resources with you as well that you can share with them.
Yeah, and some folks were asking for the link for the map, so we'll include that, and the pledge that you shared, Dennis. So we'll be sure to send that out to folks. I'm sure there'll be several people in this room who will be spending an hour or so on the map later.
Great. I'd love to hear from them.
Yeah. So a question from John, which landscapes tend to host the most species? Is there some kind of correlation with that?
Well, the tropics is definitely in every way the highest concentration of species. So tropical forest like Amazonia, for climatic reasons, mostly, those areas are the most rich in species. They also harbor lots of rare and unusual species. But, I think a lot of us, I tend to think of forest when I think of nature, I do tend to think of forest, but it's really important. Anytime you have zones meeting, and that's a way of saying like shoreline, right? Fresh water, where forest might come up against water, those border regions tend to harbor lots of biodiversity, for example. And in fact, grasslands, which the Midwestern US, before it was almost completely converted to agriculture, was home to so much important grassland. So that's an example of, maybe in terms of vertebrate species, it's not rich, but that's where the rareness comes in. There are species that can only occupy the grasslands. And once we start to get more information on the map about insects, then you're going to find much more richness in insects in a greater variety of habitats and ecosystems. So it's a really important question. And, so a lot of our audiences, in fact, live in urban areas, for example. So I think it's really important for people to recognize that we are in urban areas, we are living in and among species. So it's not Amazonia. It may not be on the top priority list, but there's things we can do in cities to support biodiversity. And it's where young people are going to learn, have a chance to learn this notion that they're part of nature, and that nature has a right to exist, but also that we're dependent on it. So.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask my own question. So for all of us in the audience who are now fired up and excited about protecting biodiversity, what are some of your top 5 things we should do to get involved?
Yeah, that's great. So I'm on the board of Homegrown National Park, which is Doug Tallamy's organization. And Doug has a great list of things you could do. So I'll start there. I'll start with the individual things. I think it goes kind of like, so on an individual level, if you're lucky enough to own land, your own property, or have access to it, whether it could be a schoolyard, it could be a park, there could be various pieces of land, it's absolutely true. Plant one native tree. And this is what's great about biodiversity compared to climate change. You plant one native tree and you can start to see the positive effects like almost the very next day. The native, those native plants are going to feed native insects, which in turn are feeding your native, feeding your native birds and other animals. And then the twin to that is extirpating invasives, so removing invasives. So those are volunteer things you can do. Doug also has simple things like put your nighttime lights on a movement sensor so that they're not on all the time, because he's studied and has data that shows that you really do that artificial nighttime lighting damages the native insects. Then, of course, honestly, donate your time and your money to organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust. It really makes a big difference. I know it's not necessarily the most satisfying call to action to give some money, but it makes a huge difference. And I've actually studied this, that the volunteer effort and giving money to various organizations, not just conservation organizations, has a very good knock-on effect for society in general. And most of these organizations do such good work. So that's another important thing. And then obviously spread the word in your community. Again, I'm interested, because I work with young people and teachers a lot, I'm interested in this notion called trickle out and trickle up. So, and ask questions about, how do students influence their parents, their family, and their community? So the more we can find ways to talk as community and get at least a little bit out of our echo chambers, I think that can really help. And then, to round out the list, it really is write letters and vote. Again, it can seem, you can wonder whether it's having an effect, but it clearly, again, studies show it really does have an effect. And it's important. So be engaged and become that, become that biodiversity person, become that species person that people will be like, yeah, so-and-so's really into it. I'm gonna, maybe they'll have something to say about this.
Right. Oh, they're talking about salamanders again.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, with the salamanders again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. We asked people about how they hear about Northeast Wilderness Trust, and word of mouth is one of the top ways. So whether it's hearing about an organization or sharing, I think someone in the chat, Bernie, mentioned how many species he's added to iNaturalist since planting native species in their yard, telling your friends about that and seeing the ripple effects. It's such a good point.
That's awesome. Yeah, so if anyone doesn't, probably most people know iNaturalist is this great app. It's one of the good uses of so-called machine learning or AI, which is that it can help you identify the things you're seeing. I think it's a really good use of the phone. I mean, early days, I was always very do I really want to be engaging with my phone more, while I'm out in nature? Although I often do a lot of my documentation once I come back. So, but it really makes me more observant. And I just think that's such a great example, and Doug Talmy in many ways got started on his work because he was bringing back a depleted old hay farm that he had bought in Delaware. And so he has documented the increase in the number of insect species that his native plants are feeding, and in turn, the increase in the number of bird species that are visiting, for example. So well, yeah, it's a great. Yeah.
Great, and maybe we can include the link to his book as well with the homegrown national.
Yeah,
park.
bringing nature home and nature's best hope.
Aww.
But yeah, I encourage you to visit Homegrown National Park website. It's another you can actually, so for folks who are restoring their own property, for example, or it could be it could be a school or a park. If you're doing native plantings, you can get recognized on the Homegrown National Park map. And there are some resources we're trying to increase on that website for if you want, because can be challenging to source native plants. So we have things like where you can source native plants.
That's great. Thank you so much for being with us, Dennis. I had a great time, and I'm sure everybody in the audience did as well. And on that note of making a difference, I'll just close with a quote that Wiva put in the chat, which seems like a great note to end on. Jane Goodall said, oh wait, hold on, let me get it in front of me. My screen changed. Jane Goodall said, you make a difference and you get to decide what difference you want to make. Thank you for that, Wiva. Have a great evening, everybody. Keep an eye out on your inbox for that email. We'll send that at the end of the week, likely Friday. And if you have any questions in the meantime, you can be in touch with us. Thank you so much for your time and resources and knowledge, Dennis. This was really fun.
It was terrific. Thank you. What a great group. Thanks for all your questions, and hope to hear from some of you.